So, in the beginning, God created the world, and he created us in perfect union with him. But eventually, humans took God's power into their own hands, and they began to pursue their own power and their own godliness, rather trusting in God's godliness. And so it created a division between God and his people. And eventually God made a man named Abraham, and through Abraham he made the people of Israel. And God promised that through Israel he would create union again between people and God. And Jesus would ultimately fulfill the promise between God and Israel through being a Messiah and creating union, giving us a way to have perfect union with God again. And then in 30 AD, the people's hopes of an earthly kingdom was crushed at Jesus' crucifixion. And 3 days later, Jesus rose again, and through rising again, then he created a new covenant of life in a heavenly kingdom. And he began those things and he confirmed them through his resurrection. And then 50 days later, at Pentecost, the believers were given the power of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit lived in them. And then in 30 AD, the first church was created, the Church of Jerusalem. And because the people were given the power of the Holy Spirit in them. In 32 AD, a man named Saul was radically saved, and he became Paul, and he became a huge advocate for the church, and he was a missionary for the church, and he created many churches and spread the gospel all throughout the world. And so in 32 AD, the churches of Rome and Crete were created. In 40 AD, the church of Antioch was created. In 46 AD, the church of Galatia was created. And in 50 AD, the churches of Philippi, Thessalonica. 51 AD, the church of Corinth. 52 AD, the church of Colossae and Ephesus. And Paul's missionary journeys his first missionary journey was in 46 to 48 AD with Barnabas. His second missionary journey was from 49 to 52 AD with Silas. And his third missionary journey was from 53 to 57 AD. In 54 AD, Paul was imprisoned for the sake of the gospel in Ephesus. And then I'm gonna move over here. In 58 AD, Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, and he was imprisoned again at the end of his third missionary journey from 58 to 60 AD. And again from 60 to 62 AD in Rome. It's thought that maybe Paul was released, or he may have been kept, but either way, in 64 AD, there was the fire of Rome, and that ended up leading to Nero's suicide. And in 68 AD, the Apostle John was banished to an island. And at 70 AD, the fall of Jerusalem happened, and Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled, and that certified that, or it emphasized again that Jesus was the true Messiah. And so, now we'll talk about the creation of all like the epistles and the gospels and the letters that were written by the apostles and all put into the Bible and when they were created. And so, first in 40 AD, the epistle of James was written by James, and his main emphasis was to be doers of the word. In 49 AD, Galatians was written by Paul. In 51 AD, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were written by Paul. In 53 AD, 1st Corinthians, 1st Timothy, and Titus were all written by Paul. In 55 AD, from 54 to 56 AD, Paul's prison epistles were written, and that is Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. And so the main idea behind Ephesians was that all believers are created for good works. In Colossians, it was that Christ is all you need. And in Philemon, he appealed for Onesimus, and he emphasized that through Christ, they were brothers in forgiveness. And, okay, 2 Corinthians was written around 58 AD by Paul after he was released from his imprisonment. And the main idea was that God's power is made perfect in weakness. Also in 58 AD, Paul wrote the book of Romans, shortly before his imprisonment in Rome, actually. From 60 to 64 AD, sometime in there, Peter wrote the book of 1 Peter. And also suspected during that time period, there are two options. Between 60 to 70 AD or from 81 to 96 AD, John wrote the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as well as the Gospel of John. And yeah, while we're on the topic of the Gospels, please stop. While we're on the topic of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark was written sometime between 45 and 65 AD. The Gospel of Luke was written between 55 and 60 AD. And the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew in 45 to 66 AD sometime. Those are estimates. There isn't an exact year that is known for those. Moving on, in 63 AD, Peter wrote the book of 2nd Peter, and Paul wrote the book of 2nd Timothy in 64 to 65 AD. Hebrews was written by an unknown author in 64 to 68 AD, and Luke wrote the book of Acts in 62 to 68 AD. The book of Jude was written by Jude in sometime between 65 to 70 AD. And lastly, John wrote the book of Revelation in 70 AD. And that is my timeline. Thank you.